So we're going to have an intermède philosophique between art and literature with Magali Bessone, since Magali was not able to give her talk this morning. So Magali Bessone is a professor of political philosophy at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, which is she's a member of the JPS, Institut des Sciences Juridiques et Philosophiques de la Sorbonne, and she's also an associate researcher at the CIRESC, which means her research focuses on contemporary theories of justice, theories of democracy, and critical theories of race and racism. She is the author of Sans distinction de race, which was published by Vrin in 2013. She is the co-editor with Gideon Calver and Federico Zuulo of How Groups Matter, Challenges of Toleration in Pluralistic Societies, which was published by Routledge in 2014. And she is also the co-editor with Daniel Sabag of Race, Racisme, Discrimination, une anthologie de textes fondamentaux, published by the Herman edition in 2015. She translated Du Bois, The Souls of the Black Folk, into French. Actually, I think you were the first one to translate.
Actually, no.
Okay. But why do you say it's 2007? Because you published
La Découverte, at La Découverte, it's in 2007. It was first published at Presse de l'ENS.
Yes.
In 2004.
That's true. That's true. No, yeah, but in itself, it's very interesting, and the fact that it was published by a very small.
Absolutely.
So it shows, since
you can ask me about it during the Q&A.
And she's the co-writer. She's the co-writer with Mathieu Renaud of a book to be published. So it won't be in January.
No, it will be probably fall to 2020.
A book on W.E.B. Du Bois, whose title will be W.E.B. Du Bois, Double Consciousness and Racial Condition, published by Les Éditions Amsterdam. And we thank very much Magali for being with us today.
Thank you Arnaud, thank you for your understanding and squeezing me in between art and literature this afternoon. Thank you. So yes, my goal in this presentation is to propose to interpret Du Bois' general intellectual endeavor, and particularly the writing of The Souls of Black Folk, which I know better, as a powerful and successful attempt to produce epistemic justice in a world where the color line and the veil of race have produced what Charles Mills calls an inverted epistemology, that is, an epistemology of ignorance. In this perspective, what Du Bois calls sketching the spiritual world in which 10,000 Americans live and strive, raising the veil so that the reader may see the functioning and struggles of its greater souls, ideally positioning himself as an embodiment of Black intellectuals as moving arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, summoning Aristotle and Aurelius across the color line, all converge to achieving the same objective, that is, transforming the defective episteme that frames the dominant white world and providing both the Black world and the white world with genuine knowledge. My presentation will proceed as follows. First, I will briefly present the frames of epistemic injustice and white ignorance as they were put forward respectively by Miranda Fricker and Charles Mills. And second, I'll show how Du Bois's diagnosis of white ignorance leads him to two decisive contributions in reformulating a correct epistemology. One, he aims at empowering Blacks as credible and particularly clairvoyant knowers. And second, by modifying white epistemic practices, he aims at transforming problems into apprehensible objects of scientific inquiry, objects that are considered as non-valid or inexistent in the white world. So first, epistemic injustice and white ignorance. Miranda Fricker, in her 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice, identifies two modalities of epistemic injustice, testimonial and hermeneutical injustices. The first type is related to a lack of credibility given to agents who express their experience in terms of injustice. Following José Medina's analysis in his book, The Epistemology of Resistance, it is important to understand credibility judgments as in their interactive, comparative, and especially constructed and socially constructed nature. The lack of credibility may come either from negative biases or stereotypes affecting the group of which the speaker is a member that lead to doubt agents' ability to produce a valid speech about their experience, or it may come to an excess of credibility given to other contradicting agents, to the testimony or analysis of whom we have a tendency to place a greater trust. Credibility judgments involve implicit contrasts, and excesses or deficits of credibility are attributed in comparison with what is deemed a normal knower, and according to the epistemic reputation of different social groups in regard with such normality baseline. The second type of epistemic injustice, hermeneutical injustices, is related to the lack of access of certain individuals or groups to cognitive resources, mainly due to structural unequal access to proper education that would enable them to understand, apprehend, or interpret their experiences. As again José Medina underlines, it is important to notice that the injustice may in fact not arise from the fact that subordinate groups are unable to have and produce cognitive resources, but rather from the fact that epistemic dominant groups don't recognize those resources as valid resources. In this perspective, dominant groups exhibit what Medina calls a meta-ignorance, or systemic ignorance, which consists in ignoring the indifference or misunderstanding dominant groups have or show towards the resources and knowledge produced by subordinate groups. This indifference is a sign of their own lack of epistemic resources, their inability to incorporate knowledge from alien lifestyles into their own daily experiences. So what José Medina's structural interpretation of both types of epistemic injustices reveals is that the lack of recognition of some members of subordinate groups as valid knowers does not only consist in a wrong done to one individual person in his or her capacity as a knower. Rather, it affects the whole frame of cognition, the whole epistemic architecture of a society, of dominant and subordinate groups alike. It produces a global cognitive dysfunction, an epistemology of ignorance. And when the groups in question are racial groups, when the society is organized along racial lines, as in Du Bois's Segregated America, it produces what Charles Mills calls white ignorance. White ignorance is, and I quote, an ignorance in which race plays a crucial causal role. Mills examines 10 important characteristics in order to delineate the cognitive phenomenon he calls white ignorance. So I'll simply summarize some of them, the ones that I find particularly important for my own purpose in this presentation. So first, since race is a social construct and not a biological reality, since racial groups are the products of racialization processes and not universal, homogeneous, naturally given groups, the causal mechanisms producing white ignorance have to be historicized and analyzed as socio-structural mechanisms. Second, white ignorance is concerned with patterns of ignorance in which race plays a determining role. So it does not claim to account for all false beliefs, mistaken opinions, erroneous judgments that may be the case in a given society. Although Mills acknowledges that identifying the cases in which race plays a significant role may not be that easy in contrast with other cases. But particularly, white ignorance is only one of many kinds of group-based ignorance, which may be rooted in other forms of privilege. Third, white ignorance affects both racist recognizers and non-racist ones. And the latter are defined as persons, I quote Charles Mills, who form mistaken beliefs because of the social suppression of pertinent knowledge, though without prejudice themselves, end of quote. Fourth, white ignorance is not confined to white people, but it may affect non-whites, either through patterns of epistemic hegemony depriving non-whites of pertinent knowledge, or through the adoption of by non-whites of counter or oppositional epistemologies that simply reverse but not really transform or eliminate racial hierarchies. And lastly, white ignorance is not uniform across the white population, says Mills. The white population should not be conceived as a monolith, but rather as a conglomerate of people who have many other identities besides racial ones. And those multiple identities have differential impacts on their cognitive patterns. Hence, white ignorance must be viewed as a cognitive tendency, says Mills, a doxastic disposition, but it is not insuperable or indefeasible. White people may be able to overcome white ignorance, which is the reason why the main normative goal of identifying white ignorance is to reduce, even to eliminate it, and this goal is not absurd or is not naive. This last point is of particular significance for my presentation here because my hypothesis is that Du Bois's objective throughout his work is precisely to replace white ignorance with knowledge. So second, Du Bois's diagnosis of white ignorance. It is well known that one of Du Bois's important goals in The Souls of Black Folk is to lift the veil so that the white world comes to see and understand the black world and its deeper recesses. I quote, the meaning of its religion, the passion of its human sorrow, and the struggle of its greater souls, end of quote. From a better knowledge of the black world may arise the end of color prejudice. If whites have access to the spiritual and intellectual aspirations and actual productions of the black world, intellectual productions of the black world, it may operate a change in what Mills calls their doxastic architecture. Whites may grant blacks, and I quote Mills, full cognitive standing in the polity, the official epistemic community, end of quote. Whites may recognize blacks as equal partners in the social contract instead of non-equal cognizers. In Du Bois's term, blacks may be recognized as co-workers in the kingdom of culture. It is also well known that another of his main endeavors in The Souls is to fight black ignorance, to contribute to transform what he calls the confused, half-conscious mutter of men who are black into a clear voice that sings to the sunshine. That's the last chapter. His conviction that blacks need access to higher education is one of the main sources of his disagreement with Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise. Industrial education educates or forms workers, but what is needed, says Du Bois, is to form knowers. Fight the idea that black humans' place is to be led, not to lead, to execute, but not to rule, to be looked upon, but not to see for themselves. Fighting ignorance is the best path that leads to social justice. According to Du Bois, herein lies the tragedy of the age that men know so little of men, end of quote. And the unknowing plagues both the white world and the black world. The veil lies first between both worlds, which doubly blinds whites, It stops them from acknowledging Black perspectives and Black epistemic resources, and at a meta level of ignorance, it prevents whites from perceiving their own dominant epistemic situatedness. The veil is all there is to see for the white gaze. And second, the veil also lies across or within the Black world, because white epistemic hegemony prevents Black people to share and spread their resources among themselves and constitute a strong public epistemic community. So the diagnosis of a specific racially based epistemology of ignorance in segregated America and the conviction that it ought to and effectively could be combated led Du Bois to propose radical ways to transform the dominant epistemic field. Lifting the veil consists in fighting against the discredit of Black knowers and in identifying Black problems as valid objects of knowledge. So regarding his first endeavor, Du Bois anticipates what has been since the late 20th century conceived of in terms of standpoint theory, and which has been developed mostly in feminist works. He writes in Souls, and I quote, "There must come a loftier respect for the sovereign human soul that seeks to know itself and the world about it. Herein the longing of Black men must have respect, the rich and bitter depth of their experience, the unknown treasures of their inner life, the strange renderings of nature they have seen, may give the world new points of view and make their loving, living, and doing precious to all human hearts." End of quote. Black people's experiences, both internal and external, their political and epistemic struggle to understand their divided, alienated consciousness, as well as to understand the mechanisms of the world behind the veil and above the veil, allow them to describe the world from points of view that have been, as of yet, neglected by white researchers. And these new points of view are useful, says Du Bois, for a better common understanding of the world. In Du Bois's terms, Blacks are gifted with second sight in this American world. Their situation in a world that only lets them see themselves through the revelation of the other world, their double consciousness, paradoxically provides them with the critical distancing necessary to understand that there is a specifically white and not neutral epistemic positioning that produces effects on knowledge, on the knowledge that Blacks have of themselves and on the knowledge that whites impose on the world. Hence, Blacks learn, by reflecting upon their own experience, that the white's epistemic situatedness leads them to err about the Black world, to view the Black world only partially and erroneously. Indeed, this is a characteristic of white ignorance. Blacks are not simply invisible to the white world. They are perceived deficiently. They are a problem, and this problem is supposed to have roots in nature. By contrast, Blacks, because of their own positioning, are able to see that white perception of the Black world is distorted, to develop a kind of lucidity about their own ignorance, and to provide epistemic remedies against it. When he offers a sketch of the journey of Black Americans since emancipation in Chapter 1 of Souls, Du Bois insists on their progress toward epistemic emancipation. And I quote Chapter 1, "The journey at least gave leisure for reflection and self-examination. His own soul rose before him, and he saw himself, darkly as through a veil. For the first time, he sought to analyze the burden he bore upon his back, the dead weight of social degradation partially masked behind a half-named Negro problem. He felt the weight of his ignorance." End of quote. The situation of oppression is the reason why Black knowers, despite cognitive dysfunctions produced by white hegemonic epistemology, may achieve what he calls in The Souls of White Folk, a singular clairvoyance of white blindness or white ignorance, and produce knowledge about the social world. This conviction, it seems to me, echoes what Sandra Harding assigns to standpoint theory. A standpoint, she writes, cannot be thought of as an ascribed position with its different perspective that oppressed group can claim automatically. Rather, a standpoint is an achievement, something for which oppressed groups must struggle, something that requires both science and politics. Here the term becomes a technical one in the sense that it is no longer simply another word for viewpoint or perspective, but rather makes visible a different, somewhat hidden phenomenon that we must work to grasp. End of quote. Standpoint theory does not claim that, per se, in themselves, oppressed groups are able to provide true visions of the world which would escape dominant groups. Rather, it claims that taking into account the grasping of the world from standpoints that are usually hidden or silenced allows one to realize, through a process that involves politics and science, that all knowledge is situated. It emphasizes the situatedness of knowledge production and opposes the common representation of a cognizer as a neutral, abstract, what Charles Mills calls a social Cartesian knower. Recognizing blacks as credible knowers is precious to all human hearts, says Du Bois, because it underlines that any knowledge, black or white, comes from specifically located social, historical, political, emotional practices and positions. Anyone who longs for an objective, more comprehensive, less biased knowledge of the world must engage in collaborative, democratic, and communitarian epistemic practices, embrace knowledge from mainstream and marginalized groups, so that epistemic frames may gain as much objectivity as possible. Du Bois's double consciousness has been interpreted in terms of bifurcated consciousness by Dorothy Smith and Patricia Hill Collins. The sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of another may lead to the ability to see things from both perspectives and to evaluate, compare, and critically examine both cognitive perspectives. While double consciousness is also analyzed by Du Bois as an alienated consciousness that often leads individuals to cognitive dissonance and a feeling of double estrangement from the white and the black world, it may also become an opportunity to see things alternatively from dominant and oppressed perspectives, and therefore to gain a better, more objective view of social problems. So here I have to stop because I forgot one page, I think, in my bag. So I'm sorry, I'll be back. Just for the hold this on, hold this on. And this will be my last one anyway. But I'm not comfortable enough in English to kind of speak from memory. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, and we're back. So last point. The objects of knowledge. Ignorant whites are also unable to identify some problems as valid objects of knowledge worthy of scientific inquiry. Identifying objects is decisively linked to a more radical transformation of social sciences methodology. The epistemic privilege that black people may achieve over white people lies first in their capacity to turn toward and apprehend some social issues that would otherwise stay invisible or unthinkable. And second, to capture the historical, social, and political causal mechanisms of the identified problems that would otherwise be attributed to natural and deterministic factors. Du Bois writes in his autobiography, "It was James, with his pragmatism, and Albert Bushnell Hart, with his research method, that turned me back from the lovely but sterile land of philosophic speculations to the social sciences as a field for gathering and interpreting that body of facts that would apply to my program for the Negro." End of quote. A major contribution of Du Bois's work as a historian and as a sociologist lies precisely in his unveiling of the Negro problem as a socio-historical issue whose determinants can be scientifically assessed. He draws his inspiration from what he calls realistic pragmatism to theorize sociology as the science of defining and solving social problems requiring the establishment of a science of inquiry, combining statistical method and case studies to question the transactions that people have with their environments. In The Negroes of Farmville, and even more decisively in the Philadelphia Negro, he engages in the sociological study of African Americans through the collection and processing of empirical data that could discredit the dominant doctrine based on social Darwinism and Spencerian evolutionism that blacks are definitely blocked at the lowest level of the hierarchy of human civilization because by nature they are inferior to other groups. What is radically new in Du Bois is the rejection of races as biologically hereditary communities, combined with the affirmation of the socio-historical reality of races and their conceptualization as social groups constructed by relationships to be carefully studied. The Negro problem is the problem of the color line and the relations that obtains throughout or across the color line. Du Bois' study of the Black world is based on a pragmatic sociology that investigates relationships, what he identifies in Chapter 9 of Souls as, I quote, the few main lines of action and communication that obtain between groups. And he lists physical relations, economic relations, political, intellectual, and religious relations. Investigating relations undermines white foundations for sociology. That is the erroneous assumption that some pre-existing social unities, communities, should be the primary focus of sociology and that they can be grasped regardless of the relations that obtain between them. So Du Bois' program for the Negro does not only consist in focusing sociological inquiry on a neglected object of mainstream sociology, the group of African Americans, but much more radically in denouncing the epistemically flawed white conceptual apparatus that presides to the study of groups, regardless of the social asymmetrical relations that produce them. With the same aim, Du Bois, as a historian, revisits in Black Reconstruction in America the mainstream narrative that white historiography produces about the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction. Again, his aim is double. First, he insists on the active part that Black people took in their own emancipation, as opposed to readings that present them as passive beneficiaries of rights conquered for them by white Northerners, or collateral, powerless beneficiaries of a war conducted for economic reasons, opposing the industrial North to or a white industrial economy to a white agricultural economy, for a war conducted for political reasons, opposing a northern democratic form of civilization to a southern aristocratic form of civilization. So he claims that Black people took their own part and were the main reason of the Civil War. He also opposes narratives which present Black people as responsible for the failure of Reconstruction because of their lack of civilization, barbarism, and irrationality. And he insists on the double bind, what he calls the contradiction of double aims, in which Black people were caught when they gained formal freedom while remaining in material servitude. But second, and more radically, Du Bois also denounces in the last chapter of Black Reconstruction the systematic and active doxastic distortion that white historiography imposes on narratives of the past. Reviewing history textbooks, Du Bois highlights their role in the reproduction of racial prejudices and widespread ignorance about white people. He writes, "Herein lies more than omission and difference of emphasis. History, in this vein, is nothing but lies agreed upon." And this, again, echoes Charles Mill's interpretation of the epistemology of ignorance as, and I quote Mills, an agreement to misinterpret the world among dominant groups, based on a taken for granted sense of entitlement. Du Bois analyzes the production of white historians as a form of active ignorance, or what Christy Dodson calls pernicious ignorance. That is, ignorance that is consistent and follows from a predictable epistemic gap in cognitive resources and produces harm or harms specific sets of persons. White historians actively agree to omit, suppress, neglect, bind relevant facts, and smother or silence sources that they choose to consider non-credible. I quote Du Bois again, wherever a black head rises to historic view, it is promptly slain by an adjective, shrewd, notorious, cunning, sneer, or put out of view by some quite unproven charge of bad moral character. In other words, every effort has been made to treat the Negro's part in Reconstruction with silence and contempt. End of quote. The writing of history by dominant historians, motivated by their intersectional class and race interests to remain in position of privilege, is a clear example of epistemic injustice. Du Bois's effort, as a black historian, is to counteract white ignorance and produce epistemic justice. So to conclude, undermining white ignorance, debiasing knowledge, empowering black people as active, credible cognizers or knowers, developing an understanding of the structural social forces that tend to promote flawed cognitive practices has been a constant struggle for Du Bois in his lifelong fight for racial epistemic justice. Thank you.
We are glad you came.
I'm glad you invited me.
Question. Yes, intimidating. Indeed. Questions? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magali. I have a question about the way in which you make the link between the standpoint theory in Du Bois' books of texts and in those of Sandra Harding's. And I was wondering whether in her texts the reference to Du Bois exists. I mean, if the direct link is recognized and made, or is it something like underlying the text and the standpoint theory?
Thank you. So the direct link, in terms of, using the term double consciousness, exists in Iris Marion Young, exists in Patricia Hill Collins, and she talks about she talks about double consciousness as bifurcated consciousness, which, in my opinion, can only come at the end of the process. I don't think that double consciousness is in itself already a very positive way of grasping both situations. I think that the way Du Bois describes it in Souls starts with alienation, and from the white and the black world. And in Iris Young, the interpretation is a little bit different. On one hand, you have alienation from the white world that doesn't recognize you as a subject, but you can find solidarity within your own oppressed group. And again, in Du Bois, I think it's much more complicated than that. I don't think that figures such as Booker T or Alexander Cromwell or John Jones, the invented character at the end of the book, are actually living solidarity within their own groups. On the contrary, I think what Du Bois pictures is how you can feel alienated from both perspectives. But what I found interesting in Sandra Harding, and she doesn't, to my knowledge, quote Du Bois, but I may be wrong. But what I found interesting is that Harding, as one of the most interesting thinkers of standpoint theory, in my opinion, underlines that standpoint theory is something that you have to work toward. Specific knowledge achieved through standpoint theory has to be worked at, and it's a constant progress or effort. And when I read her, it really echoed Saul's first chapter. So that's, I put out the analogy.
Thank you, Magali, for this very interesting paper. I was wondering whether or not you would make a difference between double consciousness and second sight. The concept of second sight in the souls of Black folk. As far as I am concerned, I have the impression that double consciousness is about um, the grasping of the inner self of Black people, and especially Du Bois. And the concept of second sight is about looking the outside world. I'm not sure I'm clear, but I would say that the concept of second sight is a synonym of the concept of clairvoyance in the souls of white folk. So what do you think about the differentiation between those two concepts? On the one hand, double consciousness, and on the other, second sight.
Thank you. So I have two ways of responding. First, I think that you're right, both concepts should be distinguished, at least analytically or conceptually. And I think that double consciousness is a condition for second sight. There would not be any second sight if there wasn't before double consciousness, and then the reflection upon double consciousness that then may lead, but there is no certainty, and that's why Black intellectuals are important for Du Bois. There is no certainty that it will eventually produce clairvoyance, and I agree with you, clairvoyance and the second sight are probably very close synonymous terms. Now, I don't think personally that double consciousness only refers to the grasping of oneself. I think that double consciousness is perhaps the most psychological dimension of something much larger, which is the color line. And I think that the double consciousness has, as a condition, the color line. And the color line is first and foremost socio-historical, economic, and what Du Bois calls the fact that there is ignorance, there is reciprocal ignorance from both worlds, and that's the tragedy of the color line. Not only economic and political separations, but the absence of any communication about dreams, hopes, values, all the things that create a common epistemic world and a moral world. So, in my opinion, the double consciousness needs to be put on the background of the color line in order to make sense. And I don't think that it is only psychological. And I don't think that it can only be grasped with psychology, which is also, I think, the reason why Du Bois didn't follow James, but went to sociology and history, even if at the end of the day, all started with this big tall girl looking at him and with glance, etc. So, and I think that's why he didn't go to psychology as the only field of study for the Negro problem.
Thank you for your talk. I appreciate it very much. I think it's important to appreciate the fact that, now that you know that the book, The Souls of Black Folk, was published in 1903. It's a long time ago. And if we take it very, very seriously, we realize that basically America was pretty much a caste system, at the time. Which means that that basically the color line, if you can talk about the color line, was bold, operating in segregation. Implication being that Black people knew they had a place, and that place was inferior to those white people. So black people operate in a place, you know, and their lives were rather circumscribed all the time, you know. I think it's very important to appreciate that. And since that day, since that time that he lived, he wrote that anyway. I mean, he lived a long time, which gives a complexity to his life. And so if we talk about the souls of black folk in 1903, it's a long time ago, you know. And since that day, American society has changed. You know, it's changed. I mean, you know, all societies have. And I would say, and I'll speak about this tomorrow, the color line continues, and there's been progress, but it's insidious now. It's an insidious thing. If the color line was once bold and marked, and people knew it, people knew what to do, white people knew what to do, black people knew what to do to avoid conflict. Today, the color line is blurred. It's more insidious. And I'm arguing tomorrow that basically it's made known in moments of acute racialized disrespect. I call it the nigger moment. The nigger moment. The moment of acute racialized disrespect. These can be small, or these can be big. The small ones we deal with is black people, you know. And the big ones can get you killed. The big ones can make you change your job. The big ones can make you abandon your white friends. And it's traumatic. Traumatic. Not that you're not, but I'm a sociologist, so I'm dealing with it ethnographically and sociologically. And but I think it's important to realize that there's this time frame that, again, not that you don't, but to go back to 1903 and to move forward, such a difference.
Absolutely. But I was only in 1903. I mean, I didn't.
No.
Precisely.
I'm always thinking currently, but we are it's so easy to think of him as a contemporary because he is so.
I think his concepts
Absolutely.
are still useful concepts for
Absolutely.
today, but I agree with you. The application of concepts or the context from which the concepts may gain more meaning has changed. And yeah, I agree.
But I appreciate your presentation, Lucia.
My conception of double consciousness is more like what the questioner asked. Is that for Du Bois, it seems to me that what he's talking about is the internal strife that happens among black people because of the color line, because of oppression. And that, he talks about this fight that's going on within the individual and how just their dogged strength keeps them from being torn asunder. And so, and he said someplace, I think in the Souls of Black Folk, is that the whole history of the Negro can be summed up by this internal strife. And so I think that he is, I believe that my reading is that he's definitely dealing with the intersubjectivities of black people, the inner turmoil, the struggle. I mean, he talks about it as being this fight between, am I a Negro or am I black? And I think so the concentration of that concept is more of a social psychological one. But that doesn't change at all the fact that it is the color line that causes it. But so in that sense, I would agree with the question.
I think that it's important to underline that the color line causes,
of course,
okay, the internal strife
sure,
that may be addressed in terms of double consciousness. The reason why I insisted in my answer on the color line is because I think that I resist the idea that double consciousness may be valid for any subordinate group or subordinate member or any member of a subordinate group. I think there is something very specific here that is the color line. In other terms, I don't think that double consciousness may directly be applied to women, for instance, as a subordinate groups. I think that there is something specific about the color line and racial groups. And I know that, so standpoint theory has, feminist theory has used the idea of double consciousness in order to refer to the specific situation of women. And in my opinion, this is putting not enough weight on the color line in order to understand double consciousness. That's all I was trying to say. So I would agree with you that it's probably, double consciousness is probably the more intersubjective and internal aspect of a bigger issue.
It's a question for Nicolas and for you. It seems to me that Charles Mills is really the central philosopher today. Because you use him.
Well, yeah, he's for me, but I don't know.
Because I don't have the feeling that he's very much read in France, but perhaps I'm mistaken. And so, when will your translation be ready, Nicolas?
I don't know. I was thinking of translating the racial contract.
Well, it's either or it's being done.
Yeah, I know. So that's why,
So if you want to start, maybe you should consult with these people who've been doing it already.
Canada?
Canada, absolutely.
Yeah, but the project is not very much advanced. But I don't know that, so I have to check.
Well, do it.
Just because it strikes me that he seems to be a very important figure. And, so I had the chance to listen to him thanks to Sarah and Nicolas because he came.
Yeah, I invited him.
In January.
Yeah, I invited him. That's why he was impressed when you heard him.
And I was very impressed by his presentation. That would be nice to organize again something